Hello and welcome to Counterpoint. I'm your guest host, Michelle Simard, and today we have Roman Baber, candidate for the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, as well as former MPP and previously a private sector lawyer. At the news forum and this show, we provide an opportunity for voices to be heard. We thought it would be beneficial to have leadership candidates for the Conservative Party of Canada come in and discuss important issues of the day that are of interest to Canadians. We are delighted to have Roman Baber on our show. Welcome, Roman.
Good to be with you, Michelle.
Thank you for coming. And so how's the campaign going? How are you?
Good. We're in the final stages of the campaign. Votes are coming in, and we're looking forward to a successful conclusion on September 10th.
And do you feel you're making an impact?
I think there's no question that my candidacy in this race has had a tremendous effect on all other candidates and on the party as a whole. It's very good to see, after effectively working for a couple of years in defense of democracy, in defense of Canadian children and our charter, that all other candidates have now adopted a similar perspective and in fact are leading with it. At the beginning of this race, the media said, oh, Roman's going to just run on lockdowns and COVID, and that's behind us. And what happened is precisely the opposite. All the other the bulk of the other candidates are running on the democracy agenda, something that we're very happy to see. So I'm very proud of my team and our accomplishment that will certainly change the conversation in this race, in our party, and therefore our country.
Oh, that's great to hear. And you brought it up about the pandemic and your stance on the regulations imposed during the pandemic. They were and still remain the same as when you're MPP. And as we know now, this time around as a leadership candidate, more and more people, even fellow leadership candidates, are agreeing that some of the regulations need to be removed due to the collateral damage that has occurred as a result of them. In particular, health has been hit hard. And how do you feel about this?
I wish I wasn't proven right. It's very regretful what happened, Michelle. Look, my argument has always been about the fact that our pandemic response in itself was very detrimental to the health and mental health of Canadians. And I've argued that we should factor in the collateral harm of lockdowns and the closure of healthcare into our public health response. Just check out an article today from Brian Lilly. You'll see that there's now a record number of Canadians, of Ontarians, that passed away due to their surgery being delayed. And that's precisely what I argued. Surgeries delayed. Canada had about 800,000 surgeries delayed. We cannot make it up. It's very, very difficult, and that's going to result in loss of human life. We know that we missed in Ontario alone, in the first year of pandemic response, more than 1 million cancer screenings. And now we're seeing a tsunami of cancer, as in fact, I warned in my letter to the Premier, quoting the director of Prince Margaret Hospital using the phrase tsunami of cancer. And this is very unfortunate because all of this, Michelle, was reasonably foreseeable. And instead of taking a balanced approach and focusing protection on long-term care homes and building healthcare capacity, we locked down 37 million Canadians, affected their mental health severely, and definitely prejudiced their access to healthcare.
Yeah, no, I agree. And actually, one thing that was a little bit of concern for me is that I noticed that when they were doing the tolls, remember those the polls where they're like, okay, this is how many people have died so far, and this is the effect of the first wave, second wave. What was interesting is that for those who did have mental health issues and did commit suicide, they were tacking those on as it was a death due to COVID. But frankly, COVID was a byfactor of it. And I think that if we have another major pandemic like this again, I mean, how do we handle this mental health crisis? Because it really went into a mental health crisis.
So there's no question that a mental health pandemic is still gripping our nation. I do not know a single Canadian, including myself, that has not suffered some sort of an adverse mental effect as a result of the pandemic response. It's just we're social beings, especially children, and it's just very unhealthy for us to be denied socialization. But to your first point, so much of the data that this public health exercise has been predicated on has been unfair. And that is something that I've demanded from the start. The phenomena you're referring to is that we did not distinguish between hospitalizations with COVID or due to COVID, and same with deaths. We did not distinguish deaths with COVID or due to COVID. Until early February 2022, there was no acknowledgement, even though this was a very widely known fact,
Yes.
No distinction has been made out of it because it would be politically correct to suggest, well, so what? Are you only concerned about half of the amounts of deaths or 60% of the amounts of death? But there's significant value in accuracy of the data.
Welcome back, and we're here with Roman Baber, a leadership candidate for the Conservative Party of Canada. And in our last segment, we were just talking about some of the issues that was dealing with healthcare and mental health. But there's other very important issues also. And as you are aware, there's a societal shift happening in the world. And Roman, you've been alluding to this numerous times during your visits to different parts of Canada, highlighting your message: democracy needs to be preserved. You've lived through an autocratic country and believe it's not good for society. Can you tell us more about the crisis of Western democracy versus autocracy and what can be done about it?
As you mentioned, I spent the first 9 years of my life under a communist regime. That's why I know how precious and how fragile Canada's democracy is. One of the hallmarks of democracy is that we respect choice, and human dignity. And we're still treating 15% like second-class citizens, even though it makes absolutely no sense in the science. The vaccine does not stop the spread or reduce transmission. And so any suggestion that somehow any of this is demonstrably justifiable, be it passports or mandates, is nonsensible at this point. We're still making Canadians choose between their ability to put food on the table and their personal healthcare choice. And for the record, we'll still agree that it's still a choice. But making someone choose something under a threat of not being able to keep a roof over their head is no longer a choice. I'm also very concerned about the erosion of our freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is the holy grail of all rights because through speech we defend all other rights and all other Canadians. And so it's not just good for democracy, it's also good for public policy. The only reason why government would seek to abridge speech is to silence its political opponents. And we should all oppose that directly. That's why I'm going to repeal the censorship legislation. I'm going to defend regulated professionals and their ability to speak without fear of reprisal. We're going to have a serious conversation with social media companies. And I'm also going to free the media and ensure that there is no financial independence by media on government.
I absolutely agree with that because, I mean, the whole reason why media, well, back in the day, it was called the Fifth Estate. It was called the Fifth Estate for a reason. Because it was a means for people to have another state that could actually influence society and do good. But now with the influx of social media, as you said, and all different forms, now I don't even use the word journalism. I use the word media because really at the end of the day, many places that do report so-called news, I don't even call it news anymore. I call it's someone's stance or position because there's no journalistic integrity with it. And so, yeah, that would be very helpful. I think that'll be good for society. And in a way, I do think it will help preserve some of the democratic rights and freedoms that I believe many Canadians hold dear.
But we have to remember, Michelle, if I may, the role of the media, and that is to shine a light of transparency on government and keep it accountable. But how can media keep government accountable when the government signs its paycheck? It's absolutely impossible.
Exactly.
Right?
That's why I said Fifth Estate needs to be separated.
Whether it's the direct funding, whether it's the bailouts and subsidies. We didn't just have the $600 million round in 2019. We had another round right before the last federal election, a $62 million round to the news media. Imagine right before an election, the government hands over the media money. It's something you'd expect of a banana republic. And finally, we also need to make sure that we end this unprecedented advertising, this record advertising that we've seen in the last couple of years by government on the news media. The government has essentially been keeping the media afloat, and there's a rule in advertising: you do not piss off the advertiser. So any suggestion that our media is still somehow holding the government accountable is simply not credible.
Yeah, I believe so. And don't forget, you were talking about direct, but I would even advocate indirect. Because as you know, in Ontario, there's indirect ways that sometimes governments can also influence media, such as the Toronto Star. So I think that, some of your policies should be put in place because there needs to be some form of accountability. And as you said, the media, well, at least the Fifth Estate was supposed to be that integral box. So other than the media and putting like mainstream media, I would advocate that even social media, there should be some checks within social media. What is your stance on that?
Absolutely. Well, yes, 100%. Initially, there were supposed to be platforms right? They're not supposed to be called confrontation mechanisms, and they certainly should not be deciding what is right and what is wrong. And this is why I'm committed that if Facebook, if Twitter are the public square, then they ought to behave like the public square. If I'm successful to lead our country, then I will ask the Bureau of Competition to have a serious conversation with the social media companies and say, look, you enjoy all sorts of protections as a technological monopoly, including some liability protections, I believe. And so if you're going to be censoring Canadian speech online or deciding what is true or what is not true, then maybe we need to rethink some of these frameworks.
Agreed, absolutely. Because I think at the end of the day, if all that can be done is at least a disclaimer. But we'll get back to that, and we'll see you soon. Welcome back. We're here with Roman Baber, who's a leadership candidate for the Conservative Party of Canada. So, as many of you know, the Pope recently had a visit in Canada in regards to the Indigenous people. And many of the Indigenous people felt that the Pope apologizing for residential schools and the cultural genocide on their peoples was much needed. But the plight of Indigenous people doesn't end there. And Roman, I know you've been advocating a lot of policies for different members of communities within Canada. Can you tell us about some of your policies that deal with this issue?
First, I want to mention that when people ask me what have I learned in my travels throughout the last couple of months, and I crisscrossed the country 3 times now effectively, I would say a lot of Canadians don't know how raw, how still sensitive and important the issue of Indigenous relations to so many Canadians. I certainly believe that it's important that we learn from our history so we don't repeat it. But the type of divisive rhetoric that the Prime Minister uses is actually bad for reconciliation. The best thing we can do to improve for reconciliation is to improve the lives of Indigenous peoples. And so I propose to do that by a number of things. Number one, we finally have to get water right. We have no more excuses.
Yes, agreed.
We can deliver water anywhere in the world today. We can deliver it in a desert. We can deliver it in an Arctic. And we don't need filtration plants anymore or a lot of labor anymore. I'm going to use modern technology, condensation technology, to get water down by the end of my first term. Second, I think that if we're intent on defending Canadians, then we have to recognize the realities of life on reserve, in particular for our Indigenous women. And right now, so many of these living communities simply do not have law and order. And I'm not afraid to say that we need to restore law and order on reserve. A lot of Indigenous Canadians are praying that somebody would come to their defense, and we don't need to worry about political correctness and actually do what's right by people. And maybe then generally, after follow-up, I'll suggest that maybe we need to rethink life on the reserve altogether.
And what do you mean?
You know, I speak to some Indigenous leaders, and a gentleman recently brought an example for me. He said, imagine at any given community on reserve, the chief can say to you, you no longer live in your home, someone else is going to live in your home now. There are no property rights whatsoever. There are no rights that give anyone any habitation security. And I'm of the view that even though we have to respect cultural practices and hierarchy within those communities, it doesn't mean that we should not provide with Canadians with some basic safety and security, such as the ability to continue to live in their home without someone arbitrarily denying them that right. And so I think that maybe we need to look at title altogether and consider whether it will make sense to allow Indigenous peoples to actually own their own home. And home ownership makes communities better, makes communities safer. I think we should not be afraid to have all these difficult conversations. I've never been afraid to have conversations, and I think it's time. Many Canadians are counting on us.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see how that circles together to your point, because at the end of the day, if there is more law and order, and people do have home ownership, which means it's of their property, which they want to protect and take care of because they can pass it down, and that could create a little bit more peace and safety, and again, more opportunity to not just get water, but clean water. I think really that's really what it boils down to. But the unfortunate part is that governments are still dealing with this issue right now about on treaty rights, and about some tribes have still never relinquished their treaty rights. And so really what it comes down to is language. I think going back to what I mentioned earlier, the Pope using the language of apologizing and calling it cultural genocide was really helpful. And I know now many in the Indigenous circle are talking about they don't want to use the term reconciliation anymore because it has a certain connotation. So we'll see what happens. But if you were Prime Minister...
I'm less concerned with language. I'm less concerned with tradition. I'm less concerned with hierarchy and institutions. I'm more concerned with Indigenous lives. We have a catastrophe of missing and
Yes.
murdered and assaulted Indigenous women. And to suggest that we need to continue to play politics instead of coming to their defense, in my view, is not something that the government should be favoring. And again, the best thing we can do for Indigenous relations is to improve the lives of Indigenous peoples, and that means to give them, at the very least, basic safety and security.
Yes, because we all expect that, so they should also expect that too. Thank you, and we'll be right back. Welcome back, and I'm here with Roman Baber, candidate for the leadership of the Conservative Party of Canada. So on our this is our last segment, and at this point, I just wanted to, ask you, why should eligible Conservative members vote for you?
I think there are two principal reasons. One is my candidacy shakes up the Conservative Party of Canada, and we need to shake up the Conservatives. We need to ask them, where have they been for the last 2 years? Why did they not stand up for us against our cancer screenings missed, against our surgeries delayed, against the mental health pandemic that was perpetuated against Canadians? They didn't, because they were afraid of politics. They were afraid to be ousted from caucus like I was. They were afraid of cancel culture or political correctness or the Twitter mob. And that cannot happen in the Conservative Party. We need to stand on principle. The Conservative Party used to stand on principle. That's what distinguished us from the Liberals. And I'm going to insist that we say what we believe and do what we believe is right, even when it's unpopular, and not wait for the truckers to come to town and liberate us. Number two, look, a vote for me is a rejection of the COVID policies of the last couple of years. And we need to end this acute situation we're in. We still have 15% of Canadians that are treated like second-class citizens. We still have potentially new normal setting in, like Marco Mendicino saying that the federal government now sees use for the ArriveCan app after the pandemic is over. This is unacceptable. We should not allow Canada to turn into a surveillance state. And finally, we need to ensure that we have fair narrative with respect to how history regards what transpired in the last couple of years. Because if somehow all these methods, all these measures that were imposed on Canadians are justifiable, we will never go back to normal, and we will never fully get our democracy back. And that's unacceptable. We're going back to normal. We're getting our democracy back. That's what my candidacy brings to the table. And I kindly ask that they rank me first.
Well, that's pretty good. But just so you know, I don't think people necessarily want to go back to normal. I think they want some version of normal. And clearly some of the policies that you're bringing about are to improve, especially with Indigenous issues. I think that's really important, and making sure that our democratic freedoms are properly preserved, and that we don't have an Emergencies Act a situation that happens again, because there was a huge divide. Some people, we recently heard in the news that through testimony that the Prime Minister and the Cabinet were advised that there was a possible breakthrough with the trucker convoy, that maybe invoking the Emergency Act wasn't necessary. But he decided that he should still do so anyways. And I think that's extremely problematic, just for the mere reason where it's like it should be only in severe circumstances where national security truly is a threat. And if you have your national security and intelligence officers saying otherwise, there's an opportunity for a breakthrough. I think the government should do it. And if you were in government, your stance would have been...
Michelle, when I say back to normal, I mean to have the government withdraw out of this remarkable public health exercise that they're continuing to propagate. According to the National Post, more than half of Canadians had COVID in the winter, over the 5 months of last winter alone. We have 85% vaccine immunity, waning immunity though. We have massive natural immunity. There's absolutely nothing else to do. The government needs to end this public health exercise and let Canadians start healing by withdrawing from our daily lives. With respect to normal, I also suggest that we need to restore Canada's democracy. That is the most important element that I suggest is necessary right now, because without democracy, we don't have anything. Look, with respect to the invocation of the Emergencies Act, it's clear that the government has not met the letter of the law. It did not avail itself of other legislation available, such as the Highway Traffic Act or the Municipal Act. It could have gone to court, just like the Ottawa resident did, who had the honking stop. The system works. It did not. Priority goes to the province. The province does not try to stop the emergency. The alleged emergency was over by the time that the House voted on it, which was another insult in the face of Canadians. And of course, the rationale, the reasoning on which it was invoked, the suggestion that law enforcement sought that, has also been false. At the same time, we know that everything that the government said about the convoy was false. There were no weapons found anywhere near the site. There was not much foreign funding, no foreign collusion like initially alleged, and the arson was not collected.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your time, and thank you for discussing these very important issues with us. I really wish you all the best, and hopefully we get to talk again.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Have a great day. We hope you enjoyed the show, and I just wanted to note that we asked all leadership candidates to come on the show, but only Mr. Baber's team had accepted. Thanks, and have a great night.